Welcome to the first episode of our off-season series. We're excited to be back and bringing you content. The weather's finally starting to break here. We're starting to see small patches of bare ground, which we haven't seen in months. Here in Iowa, as with a lot of the country, obviously, it's been a very tough winter between the brutal cold temps, the snow, the ice, and it kind of gets you thinking about the wildlife and how much of a struggle it is for them. You know, as a hunter, as a land manager, I find myself thinking about what they have to go through and how we can help and what the upcoming year would look like. So I actually got on a call the other day with my buddy Jeremy Flinn of Stone Road Media. He's also a whitetail biologist. And we discussed those things and just kind of talked about the effects of a hard winter like this, as well as what we can or should or shouldn't do as land managers to try to help the wildlife out. So I'll let you guys listen in on that call. In the meantime, I'm gonna grab a few strands of this prairie grass here and I'll show you what that's for here in a little bit. So Jeremy, what I want to talk about today, a lot of the country obviously is experiencing a really tough winter this year. And it always gets me thinking when we go through this, what is it like for the whitetails during this time? What are the challenges for them? And I guess if you have any details with regards to, do they have any survival mechanisms that they have? Like what types of things do they do to conserve energy this time of year when we have such a tough winter? I mean, here in Iowa, we've had so many prolonged stretches of sub-zero temps. And not only that, the snow and the ice makes it really tough for them to feed on what they're used to feeding throughout the fall. So kind of go into some of those details, talk about just the challenges for the whitetails during this time.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about it, Jared, number one, from a doe standpoint, we're kind of entering that second trimester, really, for most of the does. And so on a reproductive level, the energy demands from their body aren't nearly what we're going to see once they actually have fawns and are lactating. But because they're essentially having to, in most cases, care for two different fawns that are inside of them, that energy demand is extremely intense. And so when we get these long periods of either snow and or cold, every step that doe takes is energy that they're pouring out, right? And so on a mechanism standpoint, deer are amazing creatures. We always say, like, it's amazing how they can project like when they need to drop their fawns with the best cover and the best feed available to be able to rear those fawns. But if you think about it right now, those deer know when it's time to move and when it's not time to move. Basically, what I mean by that is there's either a balance of they're going to net gain energy by getting up and feeding and then coming back to bed, or they're going to lose energy by getting up and trying to feed, which makes no sense. And so oftentimes what you'll see, and anybody that's running cell cameras at these times can see it, is if there's heavy snow, especially, I'll see zero deer movement. Right. There's no movement. The deer aren't trying to feed because essentially there's a net loss in energy there. And if we back that up, what we're talking about specifically is, every day a deer needs somewhere between 6 and 8% protein to do just basic body functions, right? Breathing, digestion, respiratory type stuff. So when you think about going out there and feeding, even if, what my mind goes to is, see how many deer are in that cut cornfield, right? Corn has a very low protein level, right? It's high in carbs, but it's low in protein. And so oftentimes in the winter, deer could essentially consume all the corn that they want and still, in essence, starve to death because there's not enough protein to continue to support those necessary body functions on a daily basis. And that's just trying to survive, right? That's literally at the minimal level that we're at, not to mention any bucks that are trying to recover from the rut, right? We talk about antler growth, especially, a lot of focus comes in that June, July time period where we're seeing almost an inch a day of antler growth happen. To me, I always pay attention to this time frame through the end of March, right? Right when we get to that green up period. So from the time that they shed their antlers to that end of March time period is so critical because they first have to repair their body. Then they're going to be able to divert resources to the antlers, right? And in what we're experiencing now with severe cold and snow and ice, there's not enough feed out there for them to continue to repair that body which is in essence is delaying antler growth, or at least resources going to antler growth, at this time period.
Yeah. As you talked about the kind of balance based on how much energy it's going to take to do certain things. Do deer come into this period of time with an energy reserve built up? And if they do, how long does that last?
Yeah, I mean, it really comes down to what kind of conditions they've experienced so far. To me, there's nothing that really brings more of a smile on my face to when I'm skinning a deer and it's got just loads of fat, down along the backstrap. We've all seen it. Anyone that's skinned a deer, in that October and even early November time period. And for a lot of that, on a doe standpoint, you'll continue to see that accumulation of fat throughout December and into January. And that's really what's going to kind of give them that ability to survive these tough conditions. Unlike what we might see in fawns and bucks, mainly because fawns essentially are still developing and still growing at such a rate that they're not able to accumulate fat like an adult doe might be able to, right? They're putting those resources into skeletal and muscular development, not just storing fat on top of it, and energy from that. Where on a buck standpoint, they can do that, but they're burning it so fast from a rut standpoint that by the time, a rut ends, oftentimes that fat reserve is completely gone, right? And so that's really what worries us, from a deer hunter standpoint, is our mature bucks are going into a winter time frame where they really need to kind of recover and rest and put those resources to building back up that muscular development. And unfortunately, they can't, because now they're faced with harsh winter conditions that are zapping the energy that they have, that are eating away at the muscular development that they have, because they either have to move and spend energy and eat away at protein, or they have to move and make sure that when they do go out and feed, there's enough there to benefit that energy that they're losing from moving during that time frame. So yeah, that's a big factor that we have to worry about with what we're spending, and it's all across the country. Unfortunately, even places in Texas where deer haven't maybe built big fat reserves because they're not used to those cold winters, are suffering just huge casualties at this point because this massive cold came in and there was no fat, there was no protection from those elements.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. That was one of the things I was wondering is, are certain deer more likely to survive, bucks versus does, older deer versus younger deer? That makes a lot of sense based on the does. The bucks have been fairly depleted as it is. So
you typically see a lot of mortality from a deer standpoint in those younger classes, right? Your fawns especially. Even in a good winter, I say good meaning warm, not a lot of snow, there will always be fawn mortalities, right? And it's just because, first of all, timing of when they're born, a fawn that's born later in the year isn't going to be as developed, meaning it's going to go into winter less prepared than one that's born earlier in the summer. But you always have that mortality, especially in harsh winters. The fawns, the younger deer, are usually the ones that are going to become most vulnerable to that. Beyond that, it's going to be the deer that have worn themselves out longer during the rut time, right? And that doesn't mean that it always is a more mature deer. It's just in an area that maybe the buck to doe ratio is out of whack, in an area that maybe is fortunate enough to have healthier young deer. And so some of those fawns come in later in the season. Well, that testosterone stays high, meaning that buck's continuing to work and continuing to rut into January and even February in some cases. Those longer stretched out periods is what really starts to wear on a deer's body, and in particular a buck's body, and makes them vulnerable to those winter and ice and freezing conditions.
Yeah. Well, especially when we experience a winter like this, I really start thinking more about what could I do more as a land manager, as a deer hunter, that type of stuff. So maybe we start at the most basic, like, should I be supplemental feeding deer corn, alfalfa? Those are some of the more popular ones. Work our way up to maybe cutting some trees to provide extra browse, and then maybe long term, what can you do in preparation? Like, what can you do to help your property be better fit to get a deer herd through winter if we have another one like this?
Yeah, I mean, in kind of emergency times, emergency measures definitely have to be called upon. It's called supplemental feed for a reason, right? It should never be the priority way to get a deer herd through these winter time periods. But often we see it. We see it almost every year in northern Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, where these deer have these wintering yards, right? And it's crazy to think that actually might be more applicable across many parts of this country this year than just those areas, but it's true. Mm-hmm. It is critical to think about what you're feeding at those times. As we just mentioned, if you're just out there dumping 200 pounds of shelled corn on the ground, those deer essentially are not getting enough protein to withstand what they need for daily bodily functions, as well as continuing to keep their muscle mass and not be depleted down to essentially bones. We call it that the deer can essentially starve to death from eating just corn in those cases.
So real quick, before we keep going on that one, can you do harm by feeding that corn, or you're just saying it's not enough? Are you doing it by kind of getting the deer to rely on that instead of seeking out other food sources?
And that's the problem is, so yeah, you absolutely can do more harm than good. If you create a situation where you have an easy site that those deer can come in and feed, and let's say it's all corn, they're essentially not going to waste their time and effort going in and consuming browse and other places, which can have better quality nutrition for them. And so essentially repeatedly coming back to these just corn sites can literally starve a deer out because it's expending energy while it's having to get up and do that. It thinks in its mind that it's consuming and it's filling their stomach. Meanwhile, the nutritional value is not enough to sustain it through these difficult periods. Yeah. And so when we get into those kind of things, it's not saying that, hey, don't feed corn at all, right? What I tend to do is look at things like cattle pellets, right? Go to your local co-op and look at cattle pellets, anything with like a 16% crude protein. It's got some fat in it, which is critical in that early, like rapid energy boost, and mix it with your corn, right? So essentially they're consuming corn, which has carbohydrates, and it is good to start building the fat. But right now what they need is they need fat and they need protein. That's what's going to continue to give them some energy on a daily basis, as well as continue to allow bodily functions and continue to keep that muscle mass built and or from depleting it any further than it actually is. Alfalfa hay is a great opportunity there. It gives some greenery, some forage that they're able to sit there, and then they can go back to bed and they can use their cud while they're doing that regurgitation process and being able to process that.
I gotcha. How about things that you could do? Again, it's a little bit of that emergency response category, yep. But how about creating some additional browse or bringing some of that browse down to where?
I love doing that. I mean, now's a great time. If it wasn't for a foot or foot and a half of snow in the woods, I'd probably be doing it right now. But now's a great time to go in and take out some of those trash trees. And trees that we're looking at from a timber or a wildlife value that isn't necessarily where we want it to be, are great opportunities to drop and put into that level of the deer, whether it's hickories or hackberries, anything that's coming down and creating new browse in that 6 foot and below level, right? That's the critical level. Yep. So even if you've gone in and selectively cut an area or even clear cut an area and you say, wow, it's so thick, they've got to have forage. If that browse is above 6 feet, it's out of reach. And really for a lot of those deer, it's 4 feet and above, especially the young deer. And so going in and even cutting trees that maybe are only 5 or 6 or 7 years old and just putting them down to that level for a source of browse is super critical. And people really underestimate the amount of nutrition that resides in those tips of a lot of those browse trees, right? Yes, a lot of what is harnessed is in the roots, an actual trunk of the tree at this point, but those end points still contain a lot of protein and a lot of nutrients that those deer are critically looking for at this time of year.
Right. And you're not only providing, I guess, a temporary food source, you're also, like you said, removing the junk tree, potentially creating more sunlight to hit the ground to create more browse the following year. So it goes beyond just that one little act. And then I guess this is a little bit more of a loaded question, but what types of things could land managers focus on longer term to just have their properties set up better for a deer herd to winter on?
Yeah, I think that, often all the time we're looking at food plots and what we're planning. And we often focus on that in the key of hunting season, right? What am I planning in July and August that's ultimately going to be the best for success in September through December time period. If we're thinking about it as a true manager, we need to be thinking about the after the season and the recovery standpoint. I really love at that point leaving corn and or beans standing, because if you think about if I get 6 inches or a foot of snow even, the fact that those beans can easily still be accessed, or that corn can easily still be accessed with that snow, is critical, right? It's a good source of food in those cases. Anybody that's planting any kind of bulb brassica at this point, whether it's radishes or turnips, sugar beets, those obviously still take an effort to get down and dig into the snow. But if they can access those bulbs, there's a high source of nutrients that are available to them at that point. Again, if we think about trying to just make it past this part of the season, clovers, chicory, alfalfa, those are going to be the first things that green up in tandem with what's greening up in the woods to provide a source of protein the moment that we get out of this winter time period and into early spring. So, if we're trying to winterize our property, I love standing summer crops. I mean, it's all about structure at this point, right? If you think about it, if a deer's got to dig between a foot of snow and 4 inches of ice to access some sort of brassica underneath, it's going to fail, right? The amount of effort that they're going to have to put in to get to that is not going to be of value to them. We talked about corn. Yes, it at least is some value in a carbohydrate standpoint, but on a protein level, it's a fail. Beans standing and potted beans still on the stalks are so critical at this time period that it literally could be make or break how many deer are going to actually succumb to winter mortality, and how are your bucks and does going to come out of this winter period and start to thrive in spring. I've seen plenty of properties that have standing beans that, where people are essentially looking at a decrease in antler size after a really harsh winter. Now we're looking at the opportunity to have better antler deer because they literally had, protein after protein after protein through this entire winter period, even into March. That by the time you get to that spring green up, the amount of protein in native forage, it can basically be unrivaled to anything that we can manually plant, right? So it's literally, how do I get them from the time the first snowfall hits, when stress is really hitting, to the first green up that comes from native habitat in the woods. And for some parts of the country in the South, that could be as early as a week or two from now. Where you and I are at, it's still a month away at least.
Yeah.
So I think that balance is critical as people are looking at it. And it really puts into check, if we talk about deer numbers and total, how can we balance the deer in proportion to the lowest amount of resources during the entire year, right? Which is where we're at right now and in the next 2 weeks in most cases. Your herd should be in balance with whatever those resources are, right? And in some cases, it's a lot lower than we want to think, but there's a reason for that, because anyone who has kept that out of balance is likely going to suffer some pretty significant impacts from this big winter streak that we just had.
Yeah, it's tough to see. And like I said, it's just something you think about more, unfortunately, on years like this. It's tough just driving around, and not just deer, all the wildlife.
Yes.
Turkeys, everything are just struggling. They're just out all day long looking for food, and it's tough to see. But definitely appreciate you taking the time and providing a little additional insight on some of what's taking place and some of the things we can do just to be better land managers and not just focusing on the hunting season. So
yeah, absolutely, man. I appreciate it. And, we're all fingers crossed that we come out of this thing right and green hits before we know it. And, our deer are better for it.
What's up, man? Buddy?
That ought to be enough, I hope.
You said a good handful.
Oh yeah, that's a good handful. So yeah, I'm just working on getting this guy ready to rock. I gotta still finish his back off. Yeah, but once I get this wood distressed a little bit more, get some different colors built in there, get the back finished, it's gonna be pretty cool looking. One of a kind, that's for sure.
I like it. It's very a small profile.
Yeah,
everything just kind of in line.
Yep.
Tall, tight deer with the
And with something with a deer like this, it has to be, because you can't. If you put this on a fat base, it would look ridiculous. So this guy,
Man, look at that cape.
I'm telling you, man, his cape was completely gorgeous. The color that he had was just amazing, and how dark his forehead was, how dark the skin around his eyes.
Never once did I appreciate that.
Normally, a deer like this, by this time of the season, his cape isn't even close to that nice.
This looks like mid to late October.
Yeah. Okay.
Got him?
Yep.
So you saw Grant and I out at the property a few minutes ago. We pulled this from basically the habitat that this deer was living in most of his life, and so thought that would be a cool little addition to the pedestal mount. So we're gonna put that kind of in these gaps, and Brian also has a few ideas on how we can kind of customize it to match the hunt as well.
You bet. Yes, we'll fill in some of the grass here around the gaps around back here to kind of give it some more flow, and kind of match up with the hunt. Also, we're going to install some artificial icicles here in the back and on the front too, to match up the way that the hunt was. And then basically what you do when you're doing something like this is you play with it, you put some in, you take some out, until you're pleased with the final product. And that's what's kind of fun about doing these pedestal pieces is they're always a work in progress until you really are happy with the way that it turns out.
Yeah, my favorite part is just matching it up. You know, obviously the story for this buck was unique, and why not make the mount and the memory unique as well to match that. So
you bet. Mixing up some Bondo here. Between that and these rods that I installed in here, that will hold the icicles in place where they need to be. Mix those guys together. I just want to put a couple in, but you can pick where you want them.
I think we somehow split that.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Need a lot of that grass.
Well, we just about got this entire piece wrapped up. Per usual, Brian did an incredible job, and you also saw Josh's mount in there with the completely custom base on that. So I can't wait to see that when it's done. Well, coming up this weekend when this episode airs is the Iowa Deer Classic. We're gonna have both of these pieces in our booth, as well as a couple of other deer from Midwest Whitetail over the past year or two. So if you're in the area or you're at the show, make sure you stop by the booth and say hi. We'll have a bunch of apparel and all that type of stuff available. Moving forward for the off-season series, we're gonna keep bringing all types of content that we don't have time for during the regular season. So the scouting, the shed hunting especially, I know the guys have been out and doing really well right here as the snow's melting. You guys have been picking up a lot of antlers, so we'll bring some of that to you. Different strategy things that we'll go back from some hunts this past fall and dive into a little more detail. So look for that coming up, and on top of that, we're actually going to be producing a turkey series for the Midwest Whitetail platform, something we haven't done. We've never really aired a lot of our turkey hunts despite filming them all. This year we decided we're going to go ahead and put them on the Midwest Whitetail platform. It'll be under a different series name, but we'll talk more about that later. As always, thank you guys for joining us, and we're looking forward to this off season.